But first, today a lot of journalists and activists and politicians have been out there trying to scare you, trying to terrify you, to persuade you that global warming is destroying the world. And this is the unquestioned science. This is the verdict of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its latest report issued last night. Here is the ABC.
The world's top climate scientists have issued their most urgent warning. It's irrefutable. Humans are causing accelerated warming, which is happening at a speed not seen before.
It's bleak. The UN Secretary-General has dubbed this a code red for humanity. The world's temperature is rising faster than expected.
Others have even been more hysterical. Take Greens leader Adam Bandt, for instance. He claimed this report is proof that the Prime Minister's targets for cuts to our emissions, they're too small, he says, are a death sentence for Australia, a death sentence. The planet exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming, he claims, means we will lose the Great Barrier Reef, have widespread and sustained drought, more extreme weather events and catastrophic bushfires. They'll become the norm. Now, this is the kind of despicable scaremongering that makes children think they've got no future, no hope. It's a kind of reckless catastrophism that makes climate radicals feel entitled to stack on an absolute fit and attack our Parliament House today with graffiti to vandalise the offices of politicians too and act like complete goats.
No. We have a duty to act! Nobody is allowed to ignore this!
Well, tonight I'm going to do two things that I don't see being done, casting sweet reason. First, I'm going to tell you what this IPCC report actually says, because you're going to be surprised. And then I'm going to tell you what the real problem is. And no, it is not Australia. So, what does this report actually say? Well, bottom line, the world, yes, is warming. Has already warmed by 1.3 degrees since the Industrial Revolution really took off some 200 years ago, and it says man's emissions are to blame. But what does this actually mean for us when it comes to looking at the climate? The world has been warmer before, and the warming so far seems okay, doesn't it? I mean, our lives are longer and healthier and richer. But let's go through what this report really says about all that. I've got to start with the good news. The IPCC now admits that, yes, we are now getting what it's calling a greening trend, and bigger crops. As it puts it, changes in vegetation productivity have also been observed, as well as longer growing seasons, warmer, wetter, all that kind of stuff, more carbon dioxide, and that has to be good. No wonder people are living longer. No wonder we never hear of famines now. So, okay, well, what about all these climate disasters we're supposedly creating with our emissions? This death sentence that the Greens rabbit on about. Well, let's go through them. Floods. What a surprise. This IPCC report says it's actually got low confidence. Can't really rely on this in blaming any increase in floods to human influence, to our emissions. What's more, it's got low confidence there's been any trend in peak flows, floods, for instance. And in some regions like Australia, it says there have actually been fewer floods over the past few decades. Remember that the next time the Greens blame a flood here on global warming. Droughts. Here again, the IPCC says it's got low confidence, actually, that humans actually have caused any change in meteorological droughts in most regions, even if it does have medium confidence that humans contributed here and there to a drought, random ones. Extreme winds. Well, more good news. It seems we could actually be getting less severe winds in exactly those parts of the planet where most of us humans live. And this report also says there's little evidence for more tornadoes either. Well, what about heavy rain? Well, the IPCC report does say that has likely increased. But wait a minute, heavy rain does not strike me as a big worry. Rain is actually normally good. Hurricanes and cyclones, again, the IPCC says it's a challenge to even identify any past trends in tropical cyclones. Any. although it still somehow does claim that it's likely that a proportion of worse cyclones, as in major tropical cyclone intensities, well, that may have grown over the past 40 years. But already here we see a warning sign that maybe the IPCC scientists, who are handpicked by governments, they may be cherry picking. They've got a stake in keeping this whole scare going. Because when you go off and check elsewhere what's happening, where most landfalling hurricanes and cyclones do occur, which is the North Atlantic and in the Western Pacific, our region, you will find that, yes, indeed, the proportion of intense cyclones, the ones marked in red, it is higher. But that is only because overall we're getting many fewer cyclones than we used to. That's the top line. Now, excuse me, but fewer hurricanes and cyclones seems to me more good news. Now, I don't want to hide from you the bad bits in this report, and there are some. It says that there's evidence that we're getting more high temperatures and more heat waves, higher seas, and more agricultural droughts. It has medium confidence, something like 66%, that fire weather will be more probable in some areas, like Australia. So that's it. Now, I am not seeing our death sentence in all of that. You would have to be dishonest or an hysteric to think from this that we're all doomed. Yes, more heat waves. I said that. But that should also mean fewer cold snaps. And in truth, in fact, more people, far more people die of the cold than of the heat. A warming planet is not necessarily an unhealthier one. And rising sea levels, yes, that does sound alarming, but we now know that the vast majority of low-lying atoll islands are managing to actually grow in size or stay stable. So how much should we trust this report? Well, to underline, it is written by scientists usually with a stake in keeping the bandwagon going. And even if you do believe it, what do we do about it? Well, if warming is not as catastrophic as we thought, and I think this report makes clear it isn't, we need to work out cost-benefit in everything we do. How much is the pain of slashing our emissions worth the gain to the planet? But there's one more point there that the Prime Minister raised today, I think raised properly too. The world has been talking for 2 decades about cutting emissions, but you look at the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it keeps going steadily up. And one reason for that is that the West can cut emissions all it likes, and we do. We are cutting our emissions at great cost. But many of the very biggest emitters in the world, starting with China at that very top, look at that, more than a quarter of all human emissions, are developing countries. India, I think, there is third. And they are not cutting their own emissions. In fact, they are allowed under the Paris Accord to increase them, and they plan to for decades to come. So, to be very blunt, it is China especially, and it is not Australia, that will decide whether world emissions go up or down.
We cannot ignore the fact that the developing world accounts for 2/3 of global emissions, and those emissions are rising. It is also a clear fact that China's emissions account for more than the OECD combined.
But China and India in particular say they're not going to be cutting their emissions because they want their people to get rich, just like us. So again, Morrison is completely right. The only way to really slash world emissions is to discover the cheap and reliable technologies that will do that, and to make sure that China and India and Indonesia and Africa, they can all use them too.
Unless we can get the change in the developing countries of the world, then what we're seeing in these IPCC reports will occur. And so we need to take a different approach. We need to focus on the technological breakthroughs that are necessary to change the world and how we operate, and make sure that it's done right across the world, not just in advanced countries. It's not enough.
So ignore the hysterics, ignore the people that treat global warming as some kind of religion or some sort of front. to destroy capitalism. No, Australia does not face a death sentence. No, we're not facing all kinds of climate catastrophes, or no more than humans have always had to face. Since the days that Aborigines looked back and thought, hey, rising seas have cut off this land from New Guinea. We simply face more problems that I think we can solve. But we solve them by thinking, not panicking, not telling lies.